Hi everyone, here's the Bookchemist once again. Today I'm reviewing The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead, a book I picked without knowing anything about it, mostly of the good impression that the Underground Railroad left on me when it came out in 2016, and based off the fact that Colson Whitehead has become more and more a recognized name in contemporary American literature. As always, I'm not going to discuss what the book is about. I recently whinged about this idea of books being about stuff in a recent video, and I'm not going to talk about the plot or the characters. I will just mention that it revolves around a couple of characters in a de facto segregated juvenile institution in the Florida of the 1960s. Its protagonist, and I realize that again I'm talking about the characters, is an idealistic, rather nerdy young African-American kid who is passionate about Martin Luther King, wants to join the civil rights movement, and I must confess, as I was reading the first chapters of The Nickel Boys, I was slightly disappointed because I expected this to... I was enjoying it by all means, but I expected this to become a very straightforward, almost sentimental story of a young man's disillusionment when his ideals are confronted with the harsh reality of life. And The Nickel Boys is about that and isn't. And in the way that it is, it's immensely rewarding, both because it deals with this universal theme you find across, well, human history and across literature, the theme of disillusionment as you leave childhood behind and you become an adult, in an incredibly masterful way that reflects on the nuances of this evolution, on the way it changes you, on what you leave behind when you leave your childhood and the sense of justice that tends to accompany your childhood behind, but also in a masterful way. It deals with this in a masterful way because of the dynamics of its plot and because of how this disillusionment plays out eventually. But it's also not about this. I would say that even more than about growing up, this novel posits a fundamental question that applies to this juvenile institution in 1960s Florida the same way as it applies in jails across the world, in other institutions of this sort, in other places where there are very clear dynamics of control, in these places, in these situations where humans have power and can exercise power on others. Cruelty tends to be the norm. The worst impulses humans are capable of tend to manifest themselves. And the question that the book asks is whether these places lie outside life and outside society, and American society in particular, or whether they are just mirrors of society, of the same power dynamics you encounter everywhere in every human interaction around you, except that here any form of hypocrisy is stripped, and the people in power can actually oppress you physically and mentally and psychologically any way they want, whereas they have to maintain a veneer of coexistence in the outer and in the freer world. As most questions raised by great literature, it sounds relatively simple and straightforward when you think about it briefly, but the more you reflect on it, the more disturbing its implications become. And The Nickel Boys definitely has lots to say, not just about the America of the past, but about its legacy, the legacy of this time, of the Jim Crow laws in the southern United States, of the interactions between people in power and oppressed people in the United States across its history, and the legacy of all these situations in today's world. And no matter how optimistically you read this book, I do believe that one of its magnificent achievements is showing how this legacy might be much more concrete and much more evident than we might otherwise like to think. Colson Whitehead, no shit, is an extremely talented writer. His writing, it is slightly flowery, not in the baroque, buttery way of, say, Michael Chabon or Thomas Pynchon, and not even in the more brainy, lexically impressive way of writers such as David Foster Wallace or Don DeLillo. Even more than by his sentences, even more than being smitten by his sentences on a page-by-page basis, I was impressed by the way he can create, within just a few paragraphs, in what is, on a narrative level, a rather terse novel, the entire story of the life of not just the two protagonists of the book, but a plethora of side characters. One of the another great achievement in Nickel Boys is how this cast of kids living in this juvenile institution, in this de facto prison, their plight, their collective plight, and their individual stories interact in ways that make it clear that there really isn't a distinction there, that their individual tragedies are important and personal to each of them, but that they are also all fighting the same enemy, which is, yes, an especially cruel and especially evil supervisor, but a broader system that allowed it to be, and that, if anything, praised it for what he was doing. And this type of engaged literature is incredibly useful these days, as it's always been. It's one of the great missions of literature to show us how each of us is a universe unto ourselves, but also how no man's an island, how all of us are connected in the end. Now, on a mere matter, is the wrong word, on a matter of storytelling, this way of jumping and shifting between the character makes for a very engaging novel, where within every chapter you tend to focus on the story of one kid over another, and you get engaged with their situations and their plights, and you inevitably end up rooting for them, even though you're aware that they might be awful people on certain fronts, and you wish to hope for the best for them. You are hopeful that maybe something good will happen to them, and you invest your emotional commitment into these characters. And Colson Chabon is extremely skilled at playing with your emotional investment. He is a cruel writer, but in the best possible way. Because Whitehead never wastes time lingering on needless reflections or weighing the pace down with superfluous secondary plots, the Nickel Boys flows extremely fast and reads like a breeze. It's a pleasure to experience, but make no mistake, it also has the ambitiousness and the epic scope of a truly great novel. Its main intertext, to give you a sense of this ambitiousness, at least the way I perceived it, was Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is kind of the Moby Dick of African American literature. There's a scene in here revolving around white paint that will definitely spark a connection if you've read Invisible Man. But more broadly speaking, both novels are concerned with the way American society, and I could say capitalist Western societies in general, if I wanted to extend this point, are very good at keeping minorities, and particularly African Americans, in check, actually at exploiting them, while at the same time giving them the horrible impression that they're actually free, and that it's entirely up to them to better themselves, and that if only they wanted it hard enough, and if only they conform to the norms of society, they'll be able to achieve economic freedom, independence, wealth, all those other illusions that are presented to them. I don't know if it transpired throughout the review, but I really liked the Nickel Boys. I appreciated Zone 1, Colson Whitehead's zombie novel. I liked The Underground Railroad very much. It stayed with me for a long time after I'd finished. Nickel Boys is by far my favorite Whitehead novel I've read so far, in the way it mixes a rather straightforward plot with a very simple but very powerful twist, with themes that revolve around a few protagonists' plight, but also around society as a whole, around the way our nations, our countries evolve throughout history, around the way the dynamics of power within our societies evolve through the decades. It really has the heft and the vibe and the feel of a classic novel. I would highly recommend it to anyone who has even the slightest interest in contemporary American literature, in Whitehead's fiction, in any of the themes and points I've touched upon in my review. What did you think of The Nickel Boys? How do you think it compares to Whitehead's other novels? As I mentioned, again, I've only read these three, so I still have a lot of his stuff to check out. Thank you so much to the good people at Fleet for my review copy of the novel, and I really look forward to discussing Whitehead and The Nickel Boys in the comment section below. Thank you as always for watching the video, guys. Bye, guys.